The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the small human mining colony called New Haven when the first shadow appeared in the sky. Little Emma was playing with her stuffed rabbit in the dusty yard behind her family's small house when she looked up and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Strange ships shaped like giant metal birds were coming down from the clouds, moving faster than anything she had ever seen before. Emma's father, Tom, was working the mine shaft deep underground when the alarm started screaming across the colony. The sound was different from the usual work sirens that told everyone when to start and stop digging. This sound was sharp and scary, like the noise a wounded animal makes when it is in terrible pain. Tom dropped his tools and ran toward the elevator that would take him back to the surface. But he already knew in his heart that something very bad was happening. The alien ships landed with loud crashes that shook the ground and broke windows in many of the colony buildings. From inside these metal birds came creatures that Emma had never seen before, not even in her picture books. They walked on two legs like people, but their skin was covered in green and brown scales that looked like the armor soldiers wore in the old movies her mother sometimes watched. Their faces were long and narrow with yellow eyes that glowed like the lights in the mine tunnels, and when they opened their mouths, Emma could see rows of sharp teeth. These creatures were called Vorthak, though Emma did not know this name yet. The Vorthak had traveled across the galaxy looking for people and things they could steal and sell to make themselves rich. They had heard about the human colony on New Haven and decided it would be an easy place to attack because humans were still new to space travel and did not have very good weapons to protect themselves. Emma tried to run back to her house to find her mother and father, but her small legs could not carry her fast enough. One of the scale creatures saw her running and chased after her with long, powerful steps. Emma clutched her rabbit tighter and tried to hide behind a pile of mining equipment, but the alien found her anyway. When it reached out with its clawed hand to grab her, Emma screamed as loud as she could. The Vorthak who caught Emma was not cruel by nature, but he had been taught that other creatures were just things to be bought and sold. He had never seen a human child before and did not understand why this small bee made such loud noises or why water was leaking from her eyes. He simply picked her up like she was a piece of cargo and carried her toward his ship, ignoring her kicks and struggles. All around the colony, other Vorthak were doing the same thing. They were taking people from their homes and loading them into the metal ships like bags of grain. The colony's few security guards tried to fight back with their simple weapons, but the alien raiders had much better guns that shot beams of burning light. The humans who tried to resist were either captured or hurt so badly they could not fight anymore. Emma's mother, Lisa, had been hanging clothes outside their house when the attack began. She heard her daughter's screams and ran toward the sound, but two Vorthak blocked her path. She fought like a wild animal to get at Emma, clawing and biting at the aliens even though she knew she could not win. One of the creatures hit her with something that made bright sparks, and she fell to the ground, unable to move her arms and legs properly. From the ship, where they were putting all the captured humans, Emma could see her mother lie in the dirt. She screamed for her mama over and over again, but Lisa could not get up to help her. The little girl had never felt so scared and alone in her entire 7 years of life. The stuffed rabbit was the only familiar thing she had left, and she held it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tom finally made it to the surface just as the alien ships were beginning to leave. He saw his wife on the ground and ran to help her. But when he looked around frantically for his daughter, all he could see were the metal ships lifting off into the sky. One of them had Emma inside, and Tom knew with horrible certainty that he might never see his little girl again. He fell to his knees beside Lisa and held her while they both cried and watched the ships disappear into clouds. The leader of the Vorthak raiders was named Krell, and he was very pleased with how easy the attack had been. His ships were now full of humans who would bring good prices in the slave markets on the other side of the galaxy. He did not care that he had torn apart families or that many of the humans were crying and afraid. To him, they were just products that would make him rich. But Krell had made a mistake that he did not know about yet. He had never dealt with humans before, and he did not understand how different they were from other species in the galaxy. Most creatures, when their young were taken, would grieve for a while and then give up and try to have more offspring. Humans were not like this at all. When someone took a human child, especially a helpless little girl like Emma. It made other humans angry in a way that was dangerous and terrible to see. The news of the attack on New Haven traveled very quickly through space. Every human ship, station, and colony received the same message within hours of the raid. It told them about the attack, about all the people who had been taken, and most importantly, about 7-year-old Emma, who was now a prisoner somewhere among the stars. The message also included a picture of the little girl holding her rabbit, smiling in the sunshine just days before the attack. Captain Rex Morgan was eating his breakfast on board the human warship. Called Retribution when his communication officer brought him the emergency message. Rex was a big man with gray hair and scars on his face from many battles against pirates and other enemies of human space. He had been a soldier for most of his adult life, and he thought he had seen every kind of cruelty that one being could show to another. But when he looked at the picture of Emma and read about what had happened to her, Rex felt something burning in his chest that was hotter than any anger he had ever known before. This was not just another military mission or border dispute. This was about a little girl who should have been playing with toys and learning to read, not sitting in some alien prison ship, wondering if she would ever see her parents again. Rex stood up so fast that his chair fell over backward. He called for his officers to come to the bridge immediately, and within minutes he was giving orders that would change everything. Every human ship within 50 light years would stop whatever they were doing and join the search for Emma. Every spy, every traitor, every person who had ever owed humanity a favor would be asked to help find the Vorthack Raiders. The Retribution and dozens of other human ships began moving through space faster than they had ever moved before. They followed trails of energy signatures and questioned every alien they could find who might have information about where the Vorthack had gone. Rex knew that space was very big and that finding one small ship would be almost impossible, but he also knew that giving up was not an option. Meanwhile, Emma sat in a dark corner of the cargo hold where the Vorthack had put all their prisoners. The other humans tried to comfort her and tell her that everything would be okay, but Emma could tell from their voices that they were just as scared as she was. She hugged her rabbit and whispered to it like it was a real friend who could understand her words. The ship jumped through hyperspace, carrying Emma farther and farther away from everything she had ever known. But somewhere behind them, growing larger and more determined with each passing hour, a wave of human ships was beginning to follow their trail. The galaxy was about to learn something new about humans, something about what happened when you threatened their children. The Vorthack ship traveled for 3 days through the dark emptiness of space before it finally reached its destination. Emma had spent most of that time curled up in the corner of the cargo hold, trying to make herself as small as possible while the other prisoners whispered quietly about what might happen to them. Some of the grown-ups tried to tell her stories to keep her mind off their terrible situation, but Emma could see the fear in their eyes even when they tried to smile. When the ship finally stopped moving, Emma felt her stomach drop as they began to descend toward a planet that looked nothing like her home. Through the small window in the cargo hold, she could see a world that was mostly red and black, with orange rivers of fire flowing across its surface like glowing snakes. The air outside shimmered with heat, and even inside the ship, Emma could feel how much hotter it was getting as they got closer to the ground. This horrible place was called Kethmoran, though Emma did not know its name yet. It was a world where the worst criminals in the galaxy came to buy and sell stolen goods and captured people. The planet's surface was covered with volcanoes that never stopped erupting, and the sky was always dark with thick clouds of ash and smoke. No decent person would ever choose to live in such a place, which made it perfect for the kind of business that happened there. Krell and his Vorthack raiders landed their ship at a spaceport that looked more like a junkyard than a proper landing area. Broken ships and piles of scrap metal were scattered everywhere, and the air smelled like burning oil and rotten eggs. Emma wrinkled her nose at the awful smell and held her rabbit even tighter as the aliens began herding all the prisoners off the ship. The gravity on Kethmoran was heavier than on Emma's homeworld, which made her feel like she was carrying invisible weights on her arms and legs. Each step was harder than it should have been, and she had to work extra hard just to keep up with the adults as they were marched away from the landing area. The heat was so intense that sweat began dripping down her face within minutes of leaving the ship. Krell led his prisoners through the twisted streets of the spaceport city, past buildings that looked like they had been thrown together from whatever materials the builders could find. Some structures were made of metal sheets that had been welded together badly, while others were carved directly into the rocky cliffs that surrounded the city. Strange alien creatures watched them pass from doorways and windows, their eyes glowing in the dim light like hungry predators. Emma tried very hard not to look at these watchers because they scared her more than anything she had ever seen before. Some had too many arms. Others had faces that looked like they belonged on insects rather than thinking beings, and a few seemed to be made of liquid metal that moved and shifted like water. She kept her eyes on the ground and concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. Their destination was a massive building that rose in the center of the city like a giant stone mountain. It was shaped like a bowl that had been turned upside down, with steep walls that curved up toward a point at the top. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, and Emma could hear loud roaring sounds coming from somewhere deep inside the structure. The building made her think of pictures she had seen of ancient castles, except this one felt evil in a way that made her skin crawl. This building was a famous Crimson Pits, the most popular gladiator arena in this part of the galaxy. Aliens came from hundreds of different worlds to watch captured creatures fight each other for entertainment. The crowds would bet money on which fighter would win, and the owners of the arena made huge profits from both the betting and the tickets they sold to spectators. Krell brought his prisoners to a loading dock at the back of the arena, where they were met by Arena Master Grix. Grix was a creature that looked like a giant spider that had learned to walk on only 2 of its legs, while the other 6 arms moved constantly as he talked and gestured. His skin was a sickly yellow color, and his multiple eyes never seemed to look in the same direction at the same time. Grix examined each of the human prisoners like he was shopping for fruit at a market, poking and prodding them while he decided how much they might be worth. Most of the adults he dismissed with waves of his arms, saying they would only be good for basic slave labor in the mines or factories. But when he came to Emma, his many eyes suddenly focused on her with intense interest. The arena master had never seen a human child before, and he immediately began thinking about how much money he could make from such an unusual attraction. The crowds always got excited when they saw something new and different, and a small human fighting for her life against his collection of monsters would definitely bring in huge audiences. He could already imagine the betting money pouring in as spectators wagered on how long the little girl would survive. Grix paid Krell extra money for Emma, much more than he had paid for any of the adult prisoners. The Vorthak Raider was happy to get such a good price, and did not care what would happen to the child after he left. As far as Krell was concerned, his job was done, and he could now return to raiding other colonies for more victims to sell. After Krell left with his money, Grix had Emma taken to a special holding area deep beneath the arena. This was where he kept his most valuable fighting creatures, in a maze of tunnels and cells that had been carved out of the living rock. The air down there was even hotter than on the surface, and Emma could hear the sounds of large animals moving around in the darkness beyond her cell. The cell they put Emma in was small and made of thick metal bars that were too close together for even a child to squeeze through. There was no bed, just a pile of dirty straw on the stone floor, and a small bowl of water that tasted like it had metal dissolved in it. A single torch on the wall provided the only light, casting dancing shadows that made everything look even more frightening than it already was. But the scariest thing about Emma's new prison was what lived in the cell next to hers. Through the bars that separated the cells, she could see massive shapes moving in the darkness. Sometimes she caught glimpses of scales that reflected the torchlight like mirrors, or claws that looked longer than her entire arm. The creatures made deep rumbling sounds that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. These were draconic serpents, the most feared predators in the known galaxy. They came from a planet called Infernus, where everything was fire and lava, and they had evolved to be perfect killing machines. Each one was 12 feet tall and covered in scales harder than steel armor. They had 6 legs that ended in claws that could cut through solid rock, and their jaws were strong enough to bite through the hull of a spaceship. The draconic serpents had never been defeated in the arena. For 5 years, Arena Master Grix had sent every kind of fighter against them, from cybernetic warriors with metal bodies to psychic aliens who could move things with their minds. Every single opponent had been torn to pieces within minutes of entering the fighting pit. The creatures had become the arena's biggest attraction, and aliens traveled from across the galaxy just to see them kill. There were 6 of the dragons in the cell next to Emma, and they had been trapped there for so long that they had almost forgotten what it felt like to see sunlight or breathe fresh air. They spent their days lying on the hot stone floor, waiting for their next meal or their next battle. They had killed so many opponents that they had stopped counting, and they felt nothing but emptiness and rage. The largest of the dragons was called the Crimson King by the arena crowds because of the deep red color of his scales. He was the oldest and strongest of the group, and the other dragons looked to him as their leader. The Crimson King had been captured on Infernus when he was young, and he barely remembered his home world or what it felt like to be free. When Emma was first brought to the cell next to theirs, the dragons noticed her immediately. They had never seen anything like her before, this small, soft creature with no claws, no fangs, and no armor. She was so different from the warriors they usually fought that they could not understand why she had been brought to this place of death and violence. The Crimson King moved closer to the bars that separated their cells and lowered his massive head to get a better look at Emma. His red eyes, each one bigger than Emma's fist, studied her with the intensity of a predator examining potential prey. Emma looked back at him without screaming or trying to run away, which surprised him because every other creature that had ever seen him up close had shown immediate terror. Emma was scared, but she was also fascinated by the dragon. She had never seen anything so big and powerful before, yet something in his eyes reminded her of her pet cat back home when it was sad or lonely. She tilted her head to one side and asked in a very quiet voice if he was okay, because he looked like he might be hurt or sick. The Crimson King had not heard a gentle voice in so many years that he had forgotten such things were possible. Every sound he usually heard was either a roar of anger from another fighter, the screams of dying opponents, or the cruel laughter of the crowds who came to watch him kill. This small creature's soft words hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than rage. Emma spent her first night in the underground cell listening to the dragons moving around in the darkness next to her. She could not sleep because the stone floor was hard and cold, and every sound made her jump with fear. The dragons seemed restless too, pacing back and forth in their larger cell, like caged animals who had forgotten what freedom felt like. Sometimes one of them would let out a low rumble that sounded almost like a sigh. When morning came, or what Emma thought might be morning since there were no windows to show her the sun, a small alien creature brought her a bowl of something that was supposed to be food. It looked like gray mud and smelled even worse, but Emma was so hungry that she tried to eat some of it anyway. The taste made her stomach feel sick, and she could only manage a few small bites before pushing the bowl away. The same alien also brought food for the dragons, but their meal was very different from what Emma had been given. Large chunks of raw meat were thrown to the bars of their cell, and the dragons tore into it with their powerful jaws. Emma watched them eat and noticed that even though they were hungry, they did not fight each other for food. The biggest dragon, the one with the red scales, made sure that all the others got their share before he ate his own portion. After the meal was finished, Emma found herself looking at the Crimson King again. He was lying on the stone floor with his head resting on his front legs, and his large red eyes were staring at her with what looked like curiosity. Emma had always been told that she should not stare at strangers, but she could not help herself. There was something about the dragon that made her feel less alone in this terrible place. The Crimson King was equally fascinated by the small human. In all his years in the arena, he had never encountered anything quite like her. She was so small and fragile that he could probably pick her up in one claw, yet she did not cower in fear when she looked at him. Most creatures who saw him immediately tried to hide or run away, but this little being just sat there calmly, as if she were waiting for something. Emma decided to try talking to the dragon, even though she was not sure if he could understand her words. She told him that her name was Emma, and that she came from a place called New Haven where there were no volcanoes or scary underground tunnels. She described her home with its blue sky and green grass, and how she used to play in her backyard with her stuffed rabbit while her mother hung clothes on a line to dry. The Crimson King listened to every word, even though he could not understand the human language. But there was something about the tone of her voice that he recognized. It was the same sadness he felt when he remembered his own home world, a place of fire and freedom that seemed like a distant dream now. The little human was homesick, just like he was, Emma kept talking because it made her feel better to hear her own voice in the frightening silence of the underground prison. She told the dragon about her parents and how worried they must be about her. She described her pet cat named Buttons, who liked to sleep on her bed and purr when she scratched behind his ears. She even told him about her favorite foods and the games she liked to play with her friends at the colony school. As she talked, Emma noticed that the dragon's eyes seemed to change. They still glowed red like hot coals, but they did not look as angry as they had before. Sometimes he would tilt his massive head to one side, like he was trying to understand what she was saying. Once, when she mentioned how much she missed her mother, she thought she saw something that looked almost like sympathy in his ancient gaze. The other dragons in the cell had stopped what they were doing to listen as well. They could not understand the human words any more than their leader could, but they recognized the emotions behind them. Pain and loneliness were feelings they all knew very well. This small creature was suffering just as they were, trapped far from home with no hope of escape. Emma began to notice that the dragons were not the mindless killing machines she had expected them to be. They had their own personalities and ways of communicating with each other. The Crimson King was clearly their leader, but he was not cruel or bullying toward the smaller dragons. Instead, he seemed to protect them and make sure they were safe. When one of the younger dragons seemed restless or upset, the king would make soft rumbling sounds that seemed to calm them down. There was a female dragon with darker scales who seemed to be the king's closest companion. She was smaller than him but moved with deadly grace, and Emma noticed that she always stayed close to his side. There was also a very young dragon who still had some of the bright coloring that marked him as not fully grown. The older dragons were gentle with him, and Emma could see that they cared about each other like a real family. On her second day in the cell, Emma decided to try something that might have been very dangerous. She reached through the bars that separated herself from the dragons and held out her small hand toward the Crimson King. She had no idea if he might bite her fingers off or simply ignore her, but she felt like she needed to try to make some kind of connection with him. The Crimson King stared at the tiny hand for a long moment. He could have easily snapped it off with one quick movement of his jaws, but something stopped him. Instead, he slowly moved his massive head closer to bars until his snout was just inches away from Emma's fingers. He could feel the warmth of her skin and smell the scent that was uniquely human. Very carefully, Emma reached out and touched the tip of the dragon's nose with one finger. His scales felt warm and smooth, like polished stone that had been sitting in the sun. The Crimson King did not pull away from her touch, and Emma felt a little thrill of excitement that she had made contact with this magnificent creature. It was like being allowed to pet a wild animal that had never been tamed. From that moment on, something changed between Emma and the dragons. The barriers between their species seemed less important than the fact that they were all prisoners in the same terrible place. Emma began talking to them more often, and while they could not talk back in words she understood, they began responding to her voice with sounds and movements that seemed almost like conversation. The Crimson King would move closer to the bars whenever Emma spoke to him, and sometimes he would make low rumbling sounds deep in his throat that reminded her of a cat purring. The other dragons began showing interest in her as well, coming over to look at her when she called to them by the names she had started giving them. She called the female dragon Lady because of the graceful way she moved, and the young dragon became Little One because he was still growing. Emma started teaching them simple games that she could play through the bars of their cells. She would hold up different numbers of fingers and try to get them to count by making the same number of sounds. She drew pictures in the dirt with small stones and tried to explain what each drawing represented. The dragons seemed to enjoy these activities, and Emma could swear that they were actually learning some of what she was trying to teach them. The most amazing thing was how protective the dragons became of Emma. Whenever one of the alien guards came down to the cells, the dragons would position themselves between the guard and Emma's cell. They would stand tall and spread their wings slightly, making themselves look as large and threatening as possible. The guards quickly learned to stay away from Emma's cell unless they absolutely had to approach it. Arena Master Grix watched all of this through hidden cameras that were mounted throughout the underground prison. At first, he was simply curious about how the human child was interacting with his prize fighters. But as the days passed and the bond between Emma and the dragons grew stronger, he began to worry that his perfect plan might not work as well as he had expected. The dragons had always been vicious and unpredictable, attacking anything that came near them with savage fury. But now they seemed calm and almost peaceful when they were near the human child. Grix had been planning to put Emma in the arena with them as soon as he could arrange a big enough crowd to pay top prices for tickets. But if the dragons would not attack her, the whole spectacle would be ruined. Grix decided that he needed to separate Emma from the dragons before their bond grew any stronger. He ordered his guards to move her to a different cell on the other side of the underground complex, far away from the draconic serpents. But when the guards came to get Emma, something happened that no one had expected. The Crimson King let out a roar so loud and angry that it shook dust in the ceiling of the tunnel. All 6 dragons rushed to the bars of their cell and began clawing at the metal, trying to break through to protect Emma. The little girl was just as upset, crying and reaching through her own bars toward her dragon friends. The sound of her distress made the dragons even more frantic, and they began throwing themselves against their cell door with such force that the entire structure groaned under the impact. The guard were too frightened to approach either cell while the dragons were in such a rage. They retreated to a safe distance and called for Arena Master Grix to come see what was happening. When he arrived and saw the scene, he realized that the bond between the human child and his dragons was much stronger than he had thought possible. Grix made a decision that he would later regret. Instead of separating Emma from the dragons, he decided to use their connection to his advantage. If the dragons cared so much about protecting the human, then maybe the threat of harm to her would make them fight even more fiercely in the arena. He began planning a special event that would be unlike anything the Crimson Pits had ever seen before. Arena Master Grix spent 3 days planning the most spectacular event in the history of the Crimson Pits. He sent messages across the galaxy to every crime lord, pirate captain, and wealthy alien who had ever attended his arena. The message was simple but effective. Come see something that had never been done before, a human child facing the undefeated draconic serpents in a fight to the death. The betting odds would be incredible, and the entertainment would be unforgettable. Tickets sold faster than Grix had ever seen before. Aliens from dozens of different species bought passage on ships just to reach Kethmoran in time for the event. Hotels and gambling houses throughout the city filled up with visitors who brought bags full of money to bet on how long the human child would survive. Most people thought she would last less than 30 seconds against the dragons, but some optimistic gamblers bet that she might survive for a whole minute. Emma knew nothing about these preparations as she sat in her cell, talking quietly to her dragon friends through the metal bars. She had started teaching them a song that her mother used to sing to her at bedtime, and even though the dragons could not sing the words, they had learned to hum along with the melody in their deep, rumbling voices. The sound echoed through the underground tunnels like distant thunder. The Crimson King had become especially attached to Emma during their time together. He would lie with his great head pressed against the bars of his cell, as close to her as the metal would allow. Sometimes Emma would reach through the bars and scratch the scales around his eyes, which seemed to make him very happy. He would make soft purring sounds and close his eyes like a giant cat enjoying being petted. Lady, the female dragon, had also grown fond of Emma in her own way. She would bring small, shiny objects that she found in their cell and push them through the bars as gifts for the little girl. These were usually pieces of metal or broken chains left over from previous prisoners, but Emma treasured them because they came from her friend. She would thank Lady politely and tell her how pretty each gift was, which made the dragon bob her head in what looked like pride. Little One, the youngest dragon, had learned to play simple games with Emma. She would roll a small stone across the floor, and he would push it back to her with his nose. Sometimes they would play a version of hide and seek, with Emma covering her eyes while Little One tried to hide behind the older dragons. Of course, a 12-foot-tall dragon could not really hide very well, but Emma would always act surprised when she found him, which delighted the young creature. On the morning of the big event, alien guards came to Emma's cell with special chains and restraints. They were nervous about getting too close to the dragons, who had become increasingly protective of the little girl over the past week. The Crimson King stood up to his full height and spread his wings when he saw the guards approaching, making himself look as large and threatening as possible. His deep growl echoed through the tunnels, like a warning that he would tear apart anyone who tried to hurt Emma. But the guards had been prepared for this reaction. They carried long poles with electric prods on the end, that could shock the dragons if they got too aggressive. They also had tranquilizer darts that could make the dragons sleepy and slow if they tried to attack. Emma begged them not to hurt her friends, but the guards could not understand her human language and did not care about her feelings anyway. Arena Master Grix came down to the cells personally to oversee Emma's removal. He looked at the scene with his multiple eyes and felt satisfied that his plan was working perfectly. The dragons were clearly upset about losing their human friend, which meant they would be angry and dangerous when they were released into the arena. Angry dragons would put on a much better show for crowds and calm ones. Emma was taken from her cell and carried through the tunnels toward the arena above. As she was taken away, she could hear the dragons roaring and throwing themselves against her cell door in desperate attempts to follow her. The sound broke her heart because she knew her friends were trying to help her, but there was nothing they could do. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly and tried not to cry, because she wanted to be brave like the heroes in the stories her father used to read to her. The arena above ground was enormous, much bigger than Emma had imagined from herself far below. It was shaped like a giant bowl with steep walls rising up on all sides. Thousands of alien spectators filled the seats, and their excited voices created a roar sound that was almost as loud as the dragons had been. Emma had never seen so many different kinds of creatures in one place, and most of them looked scary or dangerous in ways that made her want to hide. In the center of the arena was a circular area covered with sand and surrounded by high walls. This was where the fights took place, and Emma could see dark stains in the sand that she tried not to think about too much. There were also several large metal gates around the edges of the fighting area, and she could hear sounds coming from behind them that suggested more dangerous creatures were waiting to be released. Arena Master Grix stood on a platform high above the fighting area where everyone could see him. He used a device that made his voice loud enough for all the spectators to hear, and he began announcing the special event that everyone had come to see. He described Emma as a rare human child who would face the undefeated champions of the arena in a battle that would be remembered for generations. The crowd cheered and made excited noises as they placed their final bets on how long Emma would survive. Some aliens laughed at the idea of such a small creature fighting the mighty draconic serpents, while others made cruel jokes about how quickly the dragons would finish their meal. Emma tried not to listen to their words because they made her feel even more scared than she already was. When it was time for the event to begin, guards used long poles to push Emma down into the fighting area. The sand was hot under her bare feet, and she could feel the heat from a volcanic world seeping up through the ground. She looked around at the high walls and realized that there was no way for her to climb out or escape. All she could do was stand in the middle of the arena and wait for whatever was going to happen next. The crowd grew quiet with anticipation as Arena Master Grix prepared to release the dragons. Emma heard the sound of heavy chains being moved and metal doors grinding open somewhere beneath the arena floor. Then came a roar so loud that it seemed to shake the entire building, followed by the sound of massive claws scratching against stone as 6 enormous creatures made their way up from the tunnels below. The first dragon to emerge in the gates was the Crimson King, his red scales gleaming under the bright lights of the arena. He was followed by Lady and the other dragons, all moving with the deadly grace of perfect predators. The crowd went wild with excitement as they saw these legendary fighters entering the arena for what everyone expected to be a very short and violent battle. But something was wrong with this picture, something that Arena Master Grix had not expected at all. Instead of spreading out and stalking Emma, like hunters approaching prey, the dragons moved directly toward her with what looked almost like concern in their glowing eyes. The Crimson King reached her first and immediately lowered his great head so that Emma could touch his nose, just like she had done in their cell below. The crowd's cheers began to fade as they realized that the dragons were not attacking the human child. Instead, they were forming a protective circle around her, with their backs turned outward toward the spectators and their wings spread wide to create a barrier. Emma felt relief wash over her as she found herself surrounded by her friends, and she reached up to pat the Crimson King's leg in gratitude. Arena Master Grix watched from his platform with growing alarm as his carefully planned spectacle began to fall apart. The crowd was becoming restless and confused, and some of the gamblers were already demanding their money back. This was not the bloodthirsty battle they had paid to see, and Grix knew that his reputation would be ruined if he could not deliver the violence he had promised. In desperation, Grix activated the neural control devices that had been surgically implanted in each dragon's brain when they were first captured. These devices could send painful electrical shocks directly into their nervous systems, forcing them to become aggressive even when they did not want to fight. He had never used them before because the dragons had always been willing to kill their opponents without encouragement. The effect was immediate and terrible. All 6 dragons suddenly roared in pain and rage as electricity coursed through their brains. Their eyes changed from curious intelligence to wild fury, and they began thrashing around as the artificial anger was forced into their minds. But even as the pain drove them toward violence, something incredible happened that no one in the arena had ever seen before. Instead of turning their rage on Emma, the dragons directed their fury at their captors. The Crimson King looked up at Arena Master Grix on his platform and let out a roar that was filled with years of hatred and the promise of revenge. Lady and the other dragons joined in, and their combined voices shook the arena so hard that cracks appeared in the stone walls. The crowd's excitement turned to terror as they realized that the dragons were no longer under control. These were not tame animals performing for entertainment, but wild predators who had finally decided to fight back against their captors. The Crimson King spread his wings and launched himself into the air, soaring toward the platform where Arena Master Grix was frantically trying to increase the power of the neural control devices. The other dragons began attacking the walls and gates of the arena, using their claws and strength to tear apart the barriers that had kept them trapped for so long. The sound of breaking metal and crumbling stone mixed with the screams of panicking spectators who were trying to escape from the chaos. Emma sat in the center of the arena, still holding her stuffed rabbit, watching in amazement as her friends fought for their freedom and hers. Captain Rex Morgan stood on the bridge of the Retribution as his fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kethmoran system. What he saw through the main viewing screen made him stop and stare in complete amazement. The prison planet that should have been heavily defended and crawling with criminal activity was instead surrounded by floating debris and disabled ships. Explosions were lighting up the dark side of the world like fireworks, and emergency broadcasts were being transmitted on every frequency. The first reports from his scouts were almost impossible to believe. The orbital defense stations around Kethmoran had been destroyed not by human weapons, but by creatures that had somehow escaped from the planet's surface. Security cameras showed massive flying beasts tearing apart military installations, while smaller creatures swarmed the corridors of space stations. The entire criminal empire that had controlled the system was falling apart from the inside. Rex had been tracking the Vorthack raiders for weeks, following a trail of clues and intercepted communications across half the galaxy. His fleet of 30 human warships had been prepared for a major battle against the planet's defenses, but it seemed like something else had already started to fight for them. The captain ordered his ships to approach carefully while his intelligence officers tried to figure out what was happening down on the surface. Meanwhile, on Kethmoran itself, the Crimson Pit's arena had become the center of a revolution that was spreading across the entire planet. The Crimson King had caught Arena Master Grix on his platform and was holding the terrified alien in his powerful jaws, shaking him like a dog with a toy. The other 5 dragons had broken through the arena walls and were leading hundreds of other captured creatures in an assault on their former prison. Emma sat safely in the middle of the destroyed arena, still clutching her stuffed rabbit and watching the chaos around her with wide eyes. Little One had stayed close to protect her, while the adult dragons fought their way through the complex. The young dragon seemed to understand that Emma needed someone to watch over her, and he curved his body around her like a living wall that kept the falling debris and fleeing aliens away from her. The creatures that were escaping from the arena's holding cells were unlike anything most people had ever seen before. There were crystalline beings from ice worlds who could freeze their enemies solid with a touch. There were shape-shifting hunters from jungle planets who could become invisible and strike without warning. There were even mechanical warriors built by long-dead civilizations, their metal bodies still functioning after centuries of imprisonment. All of these dangerous creatures had one thing in common. They had been captured and forced to fight for the entertainment of others. Now they were free, and they were very angry about the years they had spent in cages. They poured out of the arena like water from a broken dam, spreading through the criminal city and attacking anyone who had been involved in keeping them prisoner. The revolution was not limited to just the arena. News of the uprising traveled quickly through the underground networks that connected all the illegal operations on Kethmoran. Slaves in the mining camps heard about the dragons breaking free and decided it was time for their own rebellion. Prisoners at detention centers overpowered their guards and joined the growing army of escapees. Even some of the criminal aliens who had been working for the prison bosses decided to switch sides when they realized the old order was collapsing. But the most important message was traveling through space toward the approaching human fleet. A communication beacon that had been damaged in the fighting was broadcasting a weak signal that Rex's technicians almost missed. When they finally decoded it, they found something that made the entire bridge crew cheer with relief and excitement. The signal was coming from Emma herself, though she did not know she was sending it. Hidden in her stuffed rabbit was a small tracking device that her father had sewn into the toy years ago, back when she was very small and had a habit of wandering away from home. The device had been silent during her captivity because the arena's underground location had blocked its signal, but now that she was in the open air above ground, it was broadcasting her exact location to anyone who knew how to look for it. Captain Rex felt tears in his eyes as he looked at the blinking that on his navigation screen that represented the little girl they had been searching for. Emma was alive, and she was right there on the surface of the planet below them. He immediately ordered his fastest ships to begin landing operations while the larger vessels provided cover from orbit. The first human soldiers to reach the surface of Kethmoran were shocked by what they found. The criminal city was in complete chaos, with buildings on fire and alien creatures running through the streets in all directions. Some of the escaping prisoners were clearly dangerous and attacked the humans on sight, but others seemed more interested in simply getting away from their former captors. Lieutenant Sarah Brooks was leading a squad of Marines toward the arena when they encountered their first group of freed creatures. She expected to have to fight her way through them, but instead found herself face to face with a group of crystalline beings who were carrying wounded members of their own species. When they saw the human soldiers, they stopped and made gestures that seemed to indicate they wanted to help rather than fight. One of the crystal creatures, speaking in broken but understandable human language, told Lieutenant Brooks about the small human child who had somehow convinced the arena's most dangerous predators to protect her instead of killing her. The creature pointed toward the ruined arena and said that the little human was still there with her dragon friends, surrounded by the destruction they had caused in their fight for freedom. Sarah's squad moved quickly toward the arena, joined by more human soldiers, and even some of the freed alien prisoners who wanted to help rescue the child who had started their rebellion. As they got closer to the massive building, they could see the draconic serpents flying overhead, their red scales gleaming in the light from the fires below. The dragons seemed to be patrolling the area, making sure that no enemies could approach their young human friend. When the rescue team finally reached the center of the destroyed arena, they found a sight that none of them would ever forget. Emma was sitting calmly in the middle of the rubble, talking quietly to Little One, while the other dragons gathered around them protectively. She looked up when she saw the human soldiers approaching, and smiled for the first time since her capture. The dragons tensed when they saw the armed humans coming toward Emma, but she quickly stood up and called out to her protectors in the gentle voice they had come to love. She told them that these were good people who had come to help her, and that they did not need to be afraid. The Crimson King studied the soldiers carefully with his intelligent red eyes, then slowly moved aside to allow them to approach. Lieutenant Brooks knelt down next to Emma and asked if she was hurt or needed medical attention. The little girl shook her head and said she was fine, then introduced her dragon friends one by one, as if they were pets she had found in her backyard. She explained that they had protected her from the bad aliens who wanted to hurt her, and that they were really nice once she got to know them. The rescue was not without complications, however. The dragons had bonded so strongly with Emma that they refused to let her leave without them. When the soldiers tried to carry her away from the arena, the draconic serpents became agitated and began following the group at a distance. The Crimson King made it very clear through his body language that he considered Emma to be under his protection, and he was not going to abandon her now. Captain Rex arrived on the surface just as his rescue teams were figuring out how to deal with 6 enormous dragons who had appointed themselves as bodyguards for a 7-year-old girl. The situation was unlike anything in military history, and there were no protocols for dealing with friendly alien predators who refused to be separated from a human child. Emma solved the problem in the simple way that children often do. She walked up to Captain Rex, looked up at his stern face, and asked politely if her dragon friends had come home with her. She explained that they had been trapped in the bad place for a very long time, and that they just wanted to be free and happy like everyone else. She promised that they were very well behaved and would not cause any trouble if they were allowed to stay with her. Rex looked at the massive creature standing behind the little girl and realized that this was not a military decision, but a diplomatic one. These dragons had not only saved Emma's life, but they had also started a revolution that had freed thousands of other prisoners and destroyed one of the galaxy's most notorious criminal operations. They deserved to be treated as heroes rather than monsters. The solution came from an unexpected source. The freed prisoners from the arena, representing dozens of different species, approached the human rescue team and formally requested asylum in human space. They had heard about humanity's reputation for treating refugees fairly, and they wanted to start new lives in a place where they would not have to fear being recaptured and enslaved. Among these refugees were the 6 draconic serpents, who had apparently elected Emma as their official spokesperson in negotiations with the human authorities. Through her, they expressed their desire to live peacefully among humans and to use their strength to protect innocent people rather than fight for entertainment. And so it was that the rescue mission to save one little girl became the foundation for the most unusual alliance in galactic history. Emma returned home to New Haven as a hero, accompanied by her 6 dragon friends who settled into life on the human colony with surprising ease. The story of her courage and kindness spread throughout human space, becoming a legend that proved to the entire galaxy that sometimes the most powerful weapons against darkness were not guns or ships, but simply the willingness to show compassion to those who have forgotten what friendship meant